Welcome to Drinks in the Library, the only library where drinks aren't just allowed, they are required. I'm your librarian host, Gigi Howard, and each episode I'll be interviewing a guest about a much-loved book that we will be pairing with a drink for you to enjoy along with us or consider for your next book club meetup. As always, stay curious and support your local library. Hello, Libration Nation. It is spooky season. This week is Halloween, and I am so excited that our book matches up. This week we are talking about the very scary The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, also known as the Queen of Horror. My guest this week, very exciting, is a fellow Richmond podcaster, Grace Todd of the podcast Didn't Read It. Grace is an intermittent editor, book gremlin, and aspiring failed novelist, while her MFA in creative writing primarily served to exacerbate both her single-minded obsession with fiction and her dubious mental health. It did give her an excuse to lose herself in books when she should have been doing her day job, for which she is thankful. The book piles in her house are becoming more perilous and less structurally sound by the day. It was really fun to connect with Grace. I had found her online and realized that we were doing similar things, but in different ways. If you haven't already, you should definitely check out the Didn't Read It pod. And our drink this week was a dark Manhattan to go with our spooky theme. And it was made by our bartender, Brett, at the Black Iris Social Club, which is where Grace records and where we recorded this episode. And just one last thing, if you're liking the show, please tell someone about it this week. I always appreciate that. And without further ado, here is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Okay, well, let's get started.
Let's do it.
All right. Grace Todd.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to... This is like the third time I've recorded not in my studio. So we're in your studio today.
Big changes for you.
I know. I'm growing up. It's very exciting. This is beautiful. I feel like I'm an artiste. And so tell us a little bit about you, because this is special. You're also a podcaster, so I want to give that a moment in the sun.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I have a podcast called Didn't Read It. I like to describe it as a guided, irreverent tour through the literary canon. Every episode, we talk about a work of classic literature from beginning to end. We make a lot of off-color jokes about it, and we talk about why it matters, where it came from, how it still kind of resonates or doesn't resonate today. And we spend a lot of time laughing at ourselves and the foibles of the literary past.
Yeah, so I have to tell you, I haven't told you this yet, but like I found you online like 2 months ago, and I was like, oh no, we're doing the same thing in Richmond. And then I like listened to it and I was like, okay, we're both book people, but we're in different lanes. We're doing different things. And then I like reached out to you and was like, will you come on my podcast? I think you'd be amazing.
And I was so excited to get your email. I saw your email and I was like, oh, another book lady. How exciting.
Yeah. So, okay. And so we'll start with the book. So what book did you choose?
I have brought you Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House.
A light read.
Just a nice, cheerful, low-key, nothing bad happens to anybody.
And I was excited you wanted to do Halloween, so this is going to be released Halloween episode.
Yay!
My very first one. Woohoo!
I'm honored.
Yeah, and you picked our drink as well.
Yes. So we are at Black Iris, which is where I usually record, and Brett, our beloved bartender,
wonderful,
made us each a dark Manhattan.
And so what makes a dark Manhattan different from a regular?
I believe it's the Amaro.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it is rye whiskey, Amaro, Cynar, and Luxardo.
Okay. I've never heard of Amaro Cynar before.
So Amaro is a liqueur, and this one is made by Copper Fox, so it's local.
Oh.
And then Cynar is a liqueur that is made, I believe, of artichoke hearts. Oh. And it is like Greek, Mediterranean, somewhere in there.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Also fitting with the book. So we're enjoying that. We're in your studio, and we're going to be talking about The Haunting of Hill House. And I want to find out, who were you when you first read this story? Why is this story important to you?
So I discovered Shirley Jackson in my early to mid 20s, I think. And her writing is so full of very quiet rage. Mm-hmm. And I don't know exactly how old you are.
I'm 41.
Okay. So do you remember being in high school and being like a pick-me girl? Mm-hmm. And it was like devastatingly uncool to like call yourself a feminist, and if you wanted to like be cool, you had to be like, well, I'm not like other girls.
I know the vibe a little bit. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. And so like I fell into that like, early aughts trap of being like, I'm so cool. And all of my friends are guys, and I'm not like other girls. And by my early to mid 20s, I was realizing what a fundamental mistake that was. Mm-hmm. And also realizing that I was like other girls, that I liked other girls, that girls are great, actually, and not anything to separate yourself from. And on the heels of that realization, I realized I was very, very angry at how I had been made to feel like I needed to alienate myself from being a woman in order to feel accepted. Mm-hmm. And then I stumbled across Shirley Jackson and was like, this woman understands me. She gets me.
Yeah, so I think you're getting at, she had some probably rage and female rage too. Do you want to talk about that?
Her books are really quietly furious. And I think that's one of the things that's really beautiful about them is, so she's writing in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And her protagonists a lot of the time are women, not always young women, which is another thing I appreciate about her, but often young women who know something is very, very wrong with the way that they are being asked to live and behave, but lack the vocabulary and the sense of self, or even just the means, financially or logistically, to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And they spend a lot of time really trapped in that space between the knowledge that you cannot go on living this way and any meaningful solution. And I think that's a place that we are all very familiar with, not in the same way that it would have been for women in the 50s and 60s. I mean, you couldn't have a bank account, right?
Right.
But I think we spend a lot of time now trapped in a space of knowing something is wrong, like with climate change or politics, and not really having a meaningful way to affect a change. And that drives you kind of mad, I think, in a very particular way. Mm-hmm. And she captures that so well and so stirringly.
Yeah. And, well, I'm thinking of specific characters with what you're talking about, but I'm going to let you lead us into the story and the listeners can guess.
So The Haunting of Hill House is, in my opinion, the best haunted house story ever written. Just full stop. It's amazing. And it has one of the best opening passages in all of horror literature. Could I?
Yeah. Oh, please.
First lines. Oh, God. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone.
Yes.
Just immediately you're like, oh no.
Don't go in.
Nothing can, so scary.
Yeah.
So the story of the haunting of Hill House is there are four people come together in this house called Hill House. It is in upstate, I think it's meant to be New York.
Okay.
And our protagonist and narrator is Eleanor, who is a woman in her early 30s. She has sort of lost the best years of her life taking care of her sick mother. Her sister, who we meet very briefly, is kind of a turd.
No other way around it.
There's this exceedingly maddening scene where Eleanor is trying to get her sister to let her use this car that they both own half of, and her sister is talking to her in this way that is so familiarly condescending.
Yes.
It just hurts to read. But Eleanor has been invited to stay in Hill House by Dr. Montague.
Yes. Very Shakespeare-esque.
Yes. The sort of affable, bearded anthropologist who is making a study of this haunted house. He has also invited Theodora, the maybe, probably, definitely lesbian.
Yeah.
And Luke, who is a member of the family that owns Hill House. And they have kind of sent him to supervise things.
But Luke has his own troubled past.
Yes. Luke is a rich fail son and a bit of a thief.
What are you gonna do?
He eyeballs the family silver in a way that is slightly disconcerting. And they are meant to spend several weeks together at Hill House, and Dr. Montague has sort of engaged them to help him make a study of psychic phenomena. And one imagines to sort of prove to himself and to the world that ghosts are real. And Theodora and Eleanor have both been invited because they have sort of documented brushes with the supernatural. And he thinks that having them in the house is going to kind of heighten the experiences that they all have. And it all starts out very, from when they all get to the house, it's one of those things where this could go like vampy, it could go jumpy, and instead it is just a harrowing, beautiful portrait of the human condition laid against some of the most frightening passages of literature I've ever read.
There's also Mr. Dudley, right?
Yes. The charming Dudleys. Mrs. Dudley, the caretaker who is straight out of like a gothic novel, and Mr. Dudley, her husband, and they have been taking care of Hill House for decades, one imagines, and seem torn between a certain glee at the idea that these people are going to get eaten alive by the house probably, and a deep-seated resentment that there are people there that they have to like do stuff for. And Mrs. Dudley is like creeps right up to the edge of being caricature and then isn't quite, in a move that's very deft. But she does this thing where she's constantly popping up in scenes and repeating herself in a way that starts funny and then gets increasingly ominous.
Yeah.
Every single meal they have, she's like, I clear at 10. I set lunch at 1. I clear at 10. I set lunch at 1. And they're like, we know. And she always just continues talking as if she doesn't hear them. And it, like, she's an echo herself in a way that becomes really disorienting as the story progresses. And of course, the Dudleys very emphatically will not stay on the property after dark. Full stop. They won't do it.
And if you scream, they won't hear you.
Yes,
for sure.
They're very emphatic about that. That's where the glee comes in. They're like, we won't hear you if you scream alone in the dark at night.
We're 6 miles away. Something like that, right?
And Theodora and Eleanor are like, we get it. Thank you.
Yeah. So, but I guess Eleanor is, like you said, she's the protagonist. And so she is on her way to Hill House. She's happy to escape her family situation, right?
Yeah. So for her, it starts out as like a big adventure, but that doesn't last very long at all. And it's all the more crushing for the fact that she started out hopeful. Like, you can see there are all of these checkpoints in the novel where you can see where another story would spool out. Mm-hmm. She has this really lovely drive up to Hill House, and there are parts where she stops and she's talking to herself about, maybe I'll just pull off in one of these little towns and just start a new life. Mm-hmm. And that could be a story. That is a different story. And then she gets to Hill House, and her first instinct is, I should not be here and I should leave immediately. And that could be another story. But she can't quite wrench herself out of the narrative that she is in a way that, like, borders on being metatextual, but I think also shows you that what's tragic about Eleanor is that she doesn't have enough of, like, a sense of self to heed the warnings.
Yeah.
That she's being given.
Yeah.
She has just enough intellect and canniness to know what she should do, but not the sort of depth of self-knowledge that it would take to do it and to kind of swim against the tide in order to do it. Mm-hmm. And this continues, sort of within her dynamic with Theodora, who is the complete opposite. Theodora does not mind being the center of attention. Theodora knows herself very well. Theodora is probably queer. Mm-hmm. And their friendship tiptoes right up to the line between, like, affection and infatuation. Mm-hmm. In a way that feels very familiar. I think a lot of queer young women have experienced friendships that, like, flare up really high and hot and really tiptoe around, like, oh, what are we doing here? Yeah. What's happening? We're sure doing a lot of hand-holding.
Yeah, so that was Theodora and Eleanor's sort of relationship.
Yeah, and their dynamic kind of belongs on much younger women. They're both in their 30s, and they're behaving like they are younger. Mm-hmm. But there's also something about this situation of all the four of them in the house where Theodora and Eleanor are both put in the position of kind of being girlish. Mm-hmm. Like, Dr. Montague kind of becomes this de facto father figure, and Luke becomes this love interest. And in that dynamic, Theo and Eleanor slot in very neatly as kind of teenage girls in a way that then mirrors the young girls that grew up in the house that were raised by Hugh Crane, who built the house, who's this terrifying, oppressive religious figure.
Okay.
And so there's all these kind of twisted family dynamic things happening, and so Theo and Nell are kind of acting as teenagers in ways. And then when their friendship falls apart, they're sniping at each other in a way that feels very teenaged. They go from loving each other to hating each other.
Yeah.
In a way that's very 17.
Yeah. Yeah. And then do you want to talk a little bit about Hugh Crane and that backstory? Are we getting too much into it? I don't know.
No, I mean, we don't get a ton. One of the things that's really masterful about this as a haunted house story is that Jackson gives you just enough to be completely unnerved, but not enough to feel like you've ever really solved it. I think one of the things, we're in a moment where I think a lot of people regard books and movies as kind of glorified plot delivery devices.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get very hung up on getting to feel like they solved the plot. Mm-hmm. And, like, that's not the point.
Okay.
And Jackson's not going to let you do that here. Like, one of the things that's really effective about this novel is its ambiguity. So we never know what really is happening with Hill House. We know that it's something very frightening. We know that Hugh Crane was this kind of rich, monstrous, religious fanatic who had 3 wives and they all died in very disturbing circumstances, and he designed this house in a way that's really uncanny, and the house itself is off. Everything about it is off. None of the angles line up correctly. None of the doors are level. The stairs themselves are at an angle. And it's all imperceptible to the naked eye, but you can feel it.
Yes. You can feel off balance all the time.
Yeah, like you can feel that the house is wrong. And the sort of backstory is that Hugh built this house to be kind of his, I don't know, the crown in his jewel, or the jewel in his crown. I have had one mouthful of cocktail. And yeah, so his first wife dies. And then I think it's his second wife who has the little girls, but he has these two children these two daughters who wind up growing up kind of alone and unloved and unattended in this monstrous, dark, isolated house. And it clearly does something to both of them. And then there's a story, one of them, they grow up to adulthood, and one of them inherits the house and moves in and has a companion, which again, yes, lots of little old ladies had companions. There is also some stuff about this companionship that feels like it's toying with queerness. And then she dies, and the companion inherits the house, and everything gets very strange, and the companion winds up committing suicide in the library. And so the house, is one of them haunting the house? Is the house itself the malevolent force? There certainly seems to be something very uncanny happening in the nursery, which is the heart of the house. It's described that way multiple times. And the house and everything happening in the house is definitely like metaphorically playing with family and family structures and how frightening a place a family can be.
Yeah.
And especially for women, right? Like I think that women have kind of a natural affinity for haunted house stories. And I think queer people have a natural affinity for haunted house stories because they're two groups of people for whom home can never be an uncomplicated concept.
Yeah. Do you think going to Jackson a little bit, knowing what we know about her, I don't know if she had queer aspects, or do we know any of that? Or, I mean, she's female. We know this.
It's interesting. There is a lot of queerness in her books. She pretty indignantly, I'm trying to remember which, I think it might have been Hangs a Man. The reviews of Hangs a Man, some of them referred to the protagonist of that novel as a lesbian, and she got very indignant about that. And she got indignant about people suggesting that she was queer, but she also was not particularly homophobic. She knew lots of queer people. How do I put this? Theodora's description is not accidental.
Okay.
The coyness around Theo's partner that she shares an apartment with. There's a scene where Eleanor asks her something about her romantic life, and Theodore just looks at her, and Eleanor has this sort of realization that she said something wrong, but she doesn't understand what.
Yeah.
And so that's not very subtle. Like, Theo is queer-coded pretty overtly.
Okay.
Again, I think the line between affection and infatuation for teenage girls is very thin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Regardless of their sexuality.
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of your sexuality, because like you go from being like a little kid and now all of a sudden you have sexuality, and like when do you even figure out that you have it? It's hard to remember at this point, I guess.
Yeah.
So anything else, like, what do we know about Jackson?
Yeah, I mean, she's a fascinating and tragic figure. She, unsurprisingly, if you've read her novels, in which mothers are very often terrifying, monstrous figures, she had a devastatingly complicated relationship with her own mother, who was a bit of a snob and a bully. Bullied her about her weight for her entire life. She spent a lot of her adult life ping-ponging between like fad diets and diet pills, and it was rough. And her mother did a very good job kind of making sure that she would never be able to just sort of uncomplicatedly believe in herself.
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying about there's two groups of people for whom home is never safe.
Right.
There's Jackson's experience.
And at the same time, she was a mother who took a lot of joy in mothering, but her husband was worse than useless. When Jackson died, Stanley Hyman didn't know how to make his own coffee.
Oh my gosh. It's literally hot water and beans.
And they had 4 children. 4 children.
Because she was not very old. She was in her early 50s, maybe?
Late 40s.
Late 40s.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And it was probably accelerated by the diets and the pills.
Pills, yeah.
The smoking and the drinking didn't hurt either.
There you go.
But she loved her family. She loved her children. She loved being a parent. There are 2. If you are curious about her and you want to read something that is less frightening, she wrote 2 books about her children and like her family life. She was kind of a proto-mommy blogger almost. She wrote in Good Housekeeping about parenting. And the books are called...
I love the title of is her autobiography, but it's like Life Amongst the Savages.
That's one of them. So that's one of her books about her kids.
Killer title.
Yeah. And then there's a second one. I can't remember what it's called right now, but they're great. They're very funny.
Okay.
Like really, really funny. Very relatable. Honestly, I'm surprised they have not had a bigger resurgence because they feel tailor-made for today's sort of generation of like older millennial witchy moms, you know? Like really like tailor-made for them.
I kind of feel like I'm a older millennial witchy mom.
Jackson is here for you.
And I'm loving what I'm reading right now.
Yeah, her books about her family are great, and you can tell that she like really loved being a mom and loved her kids and loved the creative interplay and like loved to actually support and nurture them as little people that she saw as people. But the sheer pressure of being a wife and mother and working author who was the breadwinner of the family
And the only one that knew how to make coffee.
and the only one who knew how to make coffee was devastating.
Yeah.
And I think both things can be true. Like we did an episode about that Elizabeth Moss movie they did about her.
Okay.
And one of the things that drives me up a wall about that movie is that they cut her children out of it.
Okay.
They present her and Stanley as a childless couple, and there's a whole weird thing in there where she's very like covetous of another woman's pregnancy. And I think to erase one half of her or the other is so unfair and so reductive.
Yeah. Well, to try to make women either into, if you're a mom, then you're happy and you've never had any regrets and there's nothing that you would want. So they can't make her a mother, right? Because that's too easy. But then, so they have to make her wanting to, desperation of the things that go into that.
A hissing childless hag.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a stereotype, right? It's in our politics these days.
Oh, God, yeah. Jackson would have been horrified. But, that tension is present, too, in Hill House. One of the things is that Eleanor can't tear herself away from this situation because it's one of the first times she's felt like she belongs somewhere. She's slotted into this sort of faux family.
Yeah.
And the feeling that it gives her is so intoxicating that she can't tear herself away from it, even as it begins to become not just increasingly false, but increasingly dangerous for herself, for her literal sense of self.
Yeah. But the sense of belonging is so strong in this moment. She can't. I kind of envision it almost, you think of haunted house, you think of the mist, you think of the roots slowly making their way towards the people inside. That's the vibe I got from it.
There's a scene early in the book where she describes it's something about getting like folded into the like velvet and the curtains and the carpeting, and it's always the things that are ominous about Hill House are always the soft furnishings. Yeah. In a way that's really interesting. It's always the fabrics. It's always the furniture. It's always the beds.
Yeah.
And I think that's very intentional, right?
Yeah.
It's the feminine elements of Hill House that are reaching and smothering and drowning.
Do you have a scene in here that we could touch on? Because it's not like a jump scare type story.
No.
Right? But like maybe one of the scarier moments that we could dive into just to give people a feel of what kind of horror are we looking at here?
Of what it feels like to have slowly building dread. I was reading this book. My partner was out doing business things.
Yes.
I was alone, and it was at night, and I was reading, and I was like, this was a mistake. It's one of my favorite books. I've read it like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
And even so, if you read it, I realize now at this moment that this does not sound like I am recommending it. I am recommending it. You should read it. Just not alone at night if you're particularly jumpy.
Yeah.
One of the most terrifying moments comes a little late in the book. I don't know how late in the book we want to go, but there is a scene. Let's see. So this is chapter 5, section 4. This is a little bit later in the book after things have kind of started to dial up a notch, but Theodora and Eleanor are sharing a bedroom because something has happened to Theodora's room, which I won't spoil. But the happenings in the house have become increasingly sort of dramatic, and they are in. It is nighttime. They're in beds next to each other. They've just moved a spare bed in, and they are holding hands. Yeah, like between the beds, they're holding hands as they listen. Eleanor's lying there awake in the dark, hearing this unearthly. There's this voice that is talking to itself, and sometimes it's laughing and sometimes it's crying, and it slowly turns into what sounds like a weeping child. And all of a sudden, Eleanor realizes that it's dark, and it shouldn't be dark because she and Theodora fell asleep with the light on, and she's starting to panic, but she can't move, and she's sort of trapped in this space that is like between consciousness and dreaming. And should I read a passage?
Yeah.
So she's realized it's dark, and again she's holding Theodora's hand for dear life. And it says, "Then the little gurgling laugh came again, and the rising mad sound of it drowned out the voice, and then suddenly absolute silence. Eleanor took a breath, wondering if she could speak now, and then she heard a little soft cry which broke her heart. A little infinitely sad cry, a little sweet moan of wild sadness. It is a child, she thought with disbelief. A child is crying somewhere. And then, upon that thought, came the wild shrieking voice she had never heard before, and yet knew she had heard always in her nightmares. 'Go away,' it screamed. 'Go away, don't hurt me.' And, after sobbing, 'Please don't hurt me. Please let me go home.' And then the sad little crying again. And I'm going to jump down a little bit. Now, Eleanor thought, perceiving that she was lying sideways on the bed in the black darkness, holding with both hands to Theodora's hand, holding so tight she could feel the fine bones of Theodora's fingers. Now, I will not endure this. They think to scare me. Well, they have. I am scared. But more than that, I am a person. I am human. I am a walking, reasoning, humorous human being, and I will take a lot from this lunatic, filthy house, but I will not go along with hurting a child. No, I will not. I will, by God, get my mouth to open right now, and I will yell, I will yell, I will yell, stop it, she shouted. And the lights were on the way they had left them, and Theodora was sitting up in bed, startled and disheveled. What? Theodora was saying. What, Nell? What? Good God, Eleanor said, flinging herself out of bed and across the room to stand shuddering in a corner. God, God, whose hand was I holding?
That is so like the scary story you heard when you were like a little kid with like the kids put his hand under the bed and the dog is licking his hand.
Ugh.
And then he wakes up in the morning and the dog was murdered and who was licking my hand. Sorry, it was that same vibe. I had to bring it up. It's a little weird.
No, I know what we're talking about. And it's so effective on so many levels, mm-hmm. right? Because it is viscerally terrifying. Mm-hmm. But then also this idea that the house is giving her a false sense of intimacy, and mm-hmm. Theodora herself is a false sense of intimacy. Like, right around this point in the novel is when their relationship starts to fray. Mm-hmm. And Eleanor is always so worried that she's going to wind up on the outside, that she's going to wind up ostracized. And that is a good part of what pushes her deeper into the arms of the house, essentially.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is so special about this novel is that Jackson is inarguably like one of the great masters of truly literary horror, mm-hmm. which is to say horror that is primarily preoccupied with character.
Yeah.
And these are really beautifully drawn and rendered characters. And she has such an impeccable understanding of not just people, but of dynamics and interpersonal dynamics and family dynamics and how quickly they can sour and how quickly they can bounce back.
Yeah. And
how disorienting it is to have that happen to you over and over again. To have everything feel fine and to have those little breakthroughs of warmth and intimacy that feel so comforting, and then on a dime to have that same person wounding you mm-hmm. really badly.
Yeah. And
to try and hold both of those things at once. Anyway.
The horrors persist. Well, it is such a reflection on how what is closest to you is the thing that will hurt you, kill you first. So you can totally be like, hell no, I'm not talking about this. Thoughts on the movie adaptations?
So I watched the pilot of the show.
Okay.
The show has nothing to do with the book. Mm-hmm. I don't know why they bothered licensing the name.
There it is.
It's not the same story. It's not the same story.
Right.
At all.
It's not the same. It's not for the same audience.
They could have called it something else mm-hmm. and then put inspired by Shirley Jackson in little font at the bottom. Mm-hmm. I don't know why they needed it to give it the same.
Got it.
That being said, if you want a really good Jackson film adaptation, I don't know of one for this one.
Okay.
But there's a movie adaptation of the book We Have Always Lived in the Castle.
Oh, yeah.
With Sebastian Stan in it.
Yes.
It is so good.
Yes.
And it is so true to the book.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my understanding is that I think it was either the person who adapted it for the screenplay or directed it or both, but it was a passion project. Mm-hmm. It was one of those ones that, like, they had wanted to just do for a really long time, and they finally had enough money to be like, I'm going to do this indie film that no one's going to pay to see. And they did a beautiful job. It's a love letter to Shirley.
Well, there we go. There's our recommendation. And I think there was like a version of it like called The Haunting or something in the 60s, but I don't even know if it's available.
They did, yeah. So the 60s version, now that you say that, have I seen that? I'm not sure I've ever actually seen. So the Haunting of Hill House 60s adaptation, she participated in. She saw it. And I don't remember if she liked it or not. I think she thought it was okay.
So just thought I'd throw it in there because that's something a lot of horror fans have watched in the last 10 years or whenever it's been out.
Yeah, people love that show. Even I had to buy a new copy because I loaned my actual copy to a friend.
Never
and
do it.
Couldn't find it. My new copy has the little Netflix
sticker
on the front, and I'm like,
Penguin
why?
Classic title or cover.
All I can hope is that like people buy the book because they think it'll be the show, and then they find something else and like it anyway.
Yeah. So and then talking about, let's get more people to read this book. Who would you recommend this story for?
I mean, obviously, horror. If you are a fan of horror at all, Jackson is one of the best to ever do it.
Yeah.
She has an award named after her.
Right.
There is a Shirley Jackson Award for horror writing.
Yeah.
If you don't like horror, but you enjoy narratives about feminism and uncomfortable family dynamics, and you can handle some ghostliness in and around your characters, I think you'll enjoy it. I mean, it's very psychological. If you like thrillers, I would recommend it for anyone unless you absolutely cannot handle fright of any kind, in which case she has other books that are less scary.
I don't think she has anything that's not slightly disturbing.
Well, the books about
her children.
Yeah. Those are very fun. They're hilarious. And her short fiction tends to be less disturbing. I mean, Haunting of Hill House is definitely her scariest book. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is a little more charming. It's dark, but not dark. This is definitely, this is the spookiest.
Well, it was wonderful. Anyway, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and having me in this cool studio. I left Bon Air. Who can believe it?
I'm very proud of you.
Thank you. Actually, I forgot. I wanted to give you a chance to. Is there something you want to put a spotlight on? Any projects you've got coming up?
Let's see. As this airs, we will just be wrapping up, I think, the Didn't Read It Spooky Season series, which is going to be all short horror stories. Because at the end of September, coming into October, we did a 3-part marathon on Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which is
I listened to the first one.
Yeah, thank you. So it's the first ever apocalyptic novel. But for the month of October, if you have not checked the show out yet and you would like to, these are all the episodes in October are going to be standalones. They're not 2-parters, and they're going to be funny and spooky and mostly written by women because I have an agenda.
And we're here for it.
So my show is Didn't Read It. We update every Sunday. You can find us at didn'treaditpod.com or on Instagram at Didn't Read It.
Awesome. Well, good. Well, it was lovely to meet you, my fellow Richmond book podcast friend. Cheers.
So nice to meet you, too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Good. Me, too. I'm glad. Cheers.
Happy Halloween.
Oh, happy Halloween. Spooky.
Woo.
Love that.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for spending some time with me and my guest for an episode of Drinks in the Library. For more information about the show, you can find us on Instagram at Drinks in the Library, on the World Wide Web, drinksinthelibrary.com, or shoot me an email at drinkspod@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.